more communication and information coming out of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We increased notice periods so that maybe so that parties who are not interested in accessing these rights have more time to talk with the other parties and understand sort of, how to make that work. And we also eliminated liability for the non-consenting mineral owner if a spill or any kind of other sort of pollution situation occurred. Just trying to maximize as much as possible the protections on that non-consenting party while obviously still protecting the rights of the party that's trying to access their minerals. The third piece of legislation was not a department bill, but was critical to the functions of much of our work, and that was the severance tax orbital bill, House Bill 1338. And that was a bill sponsored by the Joint Budget Committee, and the intent overall was to really try to shore up some significant shortfalls in our severance tax revenues. And I have a lot of numbers, but I'll just be really brief about it. We were looking at, at the halfway through the fiscal year, we were looking at a negative balance in our severance tax operational fund. That funds critical inspectors and staff at the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, and others. And so were nothing to happen, we would be looking at cuts to all of those Tier 1 programs and potentially layoffs. And as you can imagine, that was a pretty dire situation for our department to be in. And so we worked closely with the Office of Policy and Budget and the Governor's Office and the Joint Budget Committee, and ultimately that Joint Budget Committee sponsored a bill to stabilize DNR's severance tax funded programs through Tier 1. There's a number of things that the bill did, but largely there were a couple very significant transfers of general fund into the operational fund to shore up shortfalls for Tier 1 this fiscal year and next. There was also a transfer of general fund that would continue to provide funding for some critical Tier 2 programs, a couple of which fall within CPW, that's ANS, and the Species Conservation Trust Fund, as well as wildfire mitigation grants, and a few other programs that the legislature thought of all the Tier 2 programs really were so important that they wanted to make sure that they had funding this fiscal year. So we continue to see really fluctuating forecasts in severance tax funding over the next couple of fiscal years, but this is certainly an important and critical stopgap measure to help us continue to do a lot of the work that happens within the department. Other important bills to our department that you may have heard of but were not department bills were lottery reauthorization, and that keeps the lottery in existence, which then keeps the funding going to GOCO and through that Parks and Wildlife, and also at the very, very final hours of the legislative session, a compromise was struck to keep some important provisions in the conservation easement tax credit program. And so for those of you who aren't intimately involved, since 2000, conservation tax credits have been used to conserve more than 2.2 million acres of private land across the state. And one of the, I think, probably most critical aspects of this compromise legislation was that the conservation easement tax credit program was moved from the Division of Real Estate in DORA to a new division that we now call the Division of Conservation. And so the oversight of that program has shifted a little bit within DORA, and that I think helped some folks in the legislature feel like they were comfortable continuing to support this program going forward. The new division has a year to study a number of different issues, one of which is a new method of valuing conservation easements. So looking at ways to move away from using the pure appraisal process to value conservation easements to some other approaches. And I think that is a conversation that's very early in its stages, but we'll be interested in following that. I was going to mention the drought, but others have, so I will skip over that and just acknowledge that on May 2nd, Governor Hickenlooper activated the Colorado Drought Mitigation and Response Plan for 34 counties in the southern half of the state. And DNR, along with our friends at Department of Ag and a handful of other state and federal agencies, all sit on a drought task force that convenes regularly to monitor the situation and recommend to the governor opportunities to activate other types of measures that free up some funding and assistance across the state. And then that's my update. And then, Mr. Chairman, I thought I would touch a little bit on the progress that we're making at the department and at CPW on a study that I've mentioned to you in the past that will look at potential future funding mechanisms for parks and wildlife. And the DNR and CPW hired a consultant back in May. And the idea is for the consultant to do a literature review, to have all in one place all of the options that exist in the world that we can find, at least for funding parks and wildlife agencies, and then to apply some Colorado-specific filters to that world of options to leave us with, from a sort of purely research standpoint, what some viable funding mechanisms might be that have worked in the past and that could work under Colorado's unique political circumstances. Tabor is the best example of a unique Colorado political circumstance, and also would be economically viable in the sense that the effort to implement the funding mechanism would not outweigh the financial benefits. So a really rough return on investment calculation. And with that research, then the consultant will go out to stakeholders throughout the summer, different user groups all across the spectrum, from sportsmen to mountain bikers to wildlife watchers and hikers, and have a conversation about the practicality of these funding mechanisms, and most importantly, how the research relates to their interest in Parks and Wildlife as an agency, the value that they get from Parks and Wildlife as an agency now, and importantly, what additional or different value they are hoping to see from this agency in the future, so that ultimately we'll have a set of recommendations produced by the consultant that takes the sort of practical options and then the very important and critical willingness of people to consider these options, because nothing's a real option unless someone's interested in it, and have a package delivered to CPW leadership as well as this commission that can talk about where the agency might want to spend its time going forward. And I should have started all of this with a reminder that we're largely doing this because when we were working with the legislature on the Future Generations Act, so many legislators said, well, wait, sportsmen are the only people that pay into the agency? Well, other people should too. And we thought, that's not a bad idea, but there wasn't a really easy, oh, well, let's, go do X mechanism with Y user group, because the conversations really just haven't happened with the user community at that level. And many legislators were, I think, really interested in what they could do right then during the legislative session, and we didn't have any good information for them. So this study is in part to be, I think, responsive to what we know is a growing interest in the legislature to think about other ways that other members of the public who benefit from Parks and Wildlife as an agency could financially contribute. But then I think it also sort of naturally fits into looking at the future of the agency, and we know that more demands are being asked of the agency, whether it's challenges in wildlife management related to drought, or increased interest in recreational opportunities that you all hear from at almost every one of your commission meetings. We think that now is really a good time to put some facts on the table and see what stakeholders around the state think.
Any questions or comments from commissioners?
Maybe I failed to even tell you where we are in the process. I sort of launched into my overview. So the consultant was hired in May. They've begun the literature review process, and they should have a pretty complete literature review in the next couple of weeks. And then we've also invited a handful of experts to advise our consultant, particularly on how to design the stakeholder outreach and how to make sure that we're talking to all the right people in that stakeholder process. And we haven't scheduled anything in terms of focus groups with stakeholders, but the idea would be to do that in July, August, into the very beginning of September, and then have the recommendations of the report completed and finalized end of September.
So,
Commissioner Zimmerman.
when do you think the stakeholder process will occur? July, August, September? That quick? Okay.
Commissioner Peisel.
Just real quick, and you may not have the answer, and that's okay. It may be too soon, but have there been ideas about how you would, different ways to value conservation easements? Are there any brainstorms or thoughts, or what would that look like? And you may not know.
So thanks, Commissioner Peisel. Conversations about different ways to value conservation easements have been going on external to DNR and CPW. I know that there are folks in the land trust community and Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Land Trust in particular who have been thinking about this. I have not been directly involved in those. I think they really are brainstorming ideas at this point. And now that there's a mandate from the legislature to come up with a set of recommendations, that those conversations will likely become more formal, but I have not seen that happen yet.
Madeline, I have a softball for you, and then I'm going to update the commission on our complimentary forum that's going to go on in Crested Butte. But the softball question, because you and I have already discussed it, is why isn't the study more about brand new innovative ideas?
Yes. So in the overview document that was in the commission packet, you'll see the consultant has identified on the bottom of the third page and on to the last page a handful of funding mechanisms. And as I've seen drafts of the literature review, these really are the funding mechanisms that seem to be the content of the literature review. And there are not any big surprises in there. It's sales tax, gear tax, recreational fee ideas, and then kind of a big bucket for corporate sponsorships, privatization and contracts, and then another big bucket for voluntary contributions. So if you take a quick look at this, you might think that CPW either benefits from most of these things already, or if they don't, we've certainly, heard about it and know about it and thought about it. So what's the value add? Chairman Howard, and I think that's a really good question. The task that we've given to the consultants was to identify what's been done, not to invent some new creative ideas that have never been done. Because it's my belief that for people who have thought about this question for a long time, we've been thinking about, these ideas, but maybe not as creatively as we have in the past. And so just because we've thought about them before doesn't mean it's not smart to kind of get all the facts on the table. I'll share a bias. I have a favorite idea in this list, but I could be very wrong once I look at, really in depth how it's played out in other places, and I look at the Colorado specific analysis that says, here's the return on investment that you would get from what you thought was your most favorite idea. It might not be my favorite idea anymore. So in part, I think we need to have everyone who's been thinking about this think honestly about what their favorite idea has been, and think critically and challenge themselves about whether that should continue to be their favorite idea. And also, I think that there are ways that we could expand upon things that we've already thought about, but do it in a different way. And this is a long answer to your very short question, but I've been thinking about it a lot since you raised it. The voluntary contribution, big bucket, I think would really value, in particular from thought by the stakeholders that we engage. They all will. I think we will get very creative outside of the box thinking from the stakeholder engagement piece, because we have really smart, engaged people who care about fish and wildlife conservation in the state, and we're giving them that opportunity. But I also think that for many years, for the 10 years I've been thinking about this, it was sort of known that voluntary contributions just don't work. Unless people are required to pay, they won't. And if they do, it will be a tiny drop in the bucket, and that's not really worth it. But with the just explosion in the use of technology to pay for everything and anything in only the last few years, I just wonder if we should be challenging that historic assumption, and if there's ways to, make the thing that doesn't even seem like real money, send money to Parks and Wildlife. I don't know. So the consultant is doing what we asked them to do, which is to give us all the information about what's been done currently. So it's probably no surprise there's not anything really amazing and creative in there, because if we knew about it, we'd be doing it. And I hope that through the stakeholder engagement piece of the study, we can get some really creative ideas on how to, work with what we've got, maybe a little better than we have historically.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And, I have one request of you too, Madeline, which is I don't think the commission has had an opportunity to thank Mr. Vilsack sort of formally. And so we would love to be able to do that at some point, since he spent so many hours working on our behalf. So if he can fit that into his meeting schedule, that would be great.
I think he's already planning to join you next month.
Great.
I will mention this to him, and hopefully his plans will solidify. He would greatly appreciate that.
And I appreciate also the outreach you've done to sportsmen. I know I kind of pushed a little bit on that, and you've been so gracious and responsive, and I know they're saying the same thing to me as well. So thank you very much for that. I also want to just update commissioners on the forum that we're going to have in Crested Butte. It's going to be essentially on this same topic. It will be focused a lot on innovation. It's also never, at least in recent times, been done. We're going to have about 3 hours of talking to mostly new folks. There will be some folks that we recognize, particularly from the sportsman's community, but we are going to get out to you a big, more fulsome description so that you can prepare. I'm asking the panelists that will be presenting, they're going to have to do work beforehand with me on the phone to get ready. We're going to ask the audience to do some work. We'll start the meeting by passing out some basic data sheets, and then adopting a methodology that goes on at Amazon for meetings. I'm going to let everybody in the room spend some time with that, 5 or 10 minutes reading, under the assumption that no one actually prepares for meetings, and which is why Amazon does it that way. So we'll be doing a lot of innovative things. had a lot of help from Commissioner Zimmerman. Just for the record, I have not been able to speak to Commissioner Zimmerman directly because that would be a public meeting, but she's worked very closely with staff and will be playing a big part in the forum itself. We have 6 speakers so far, or 6 panelists. I'm hoping to get 8, but we do have enough at this point to proceed. The only real hole is we don't have a strong mountain biker, and since Commissioner Zimmerman is our strong mountain biker on the commission, if we're unable there, I think we'll still be covered. So there'll be plenty of time for commissioners to interact with panelists. There'll be some time for the public to interact in our traditional method with the blue notes and appearing at the podium, but we're going to be Facebook Live, and so we expect some interaction with the public via Facebook Live, some questions. So it's a very ambitious program. I'll be looking forward afterwards to comments from all of you of how to make it better, because our next forum will be in Glenwood Springs, I think, right? Yeah, Glenwood Springs in September. It'll be on state parks. Again, focused on our next state park, traditional ways of having a new park, but also some new innovative ideas that we want to try and think about that came up in the legislature and might make this new state park very innovative. And so that's our summer schedule. Any questions or any thought? Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One group that I have encouraged offline for us to consider how do we be innovative and think about is the adaptive sector. So there's lots of ways to do that, to be inclusive in that regard. Includes veterans, obviously injured, those that access all the amenities that we offer in that regard. So happy to help. Katie and I have had some offline. I don't know whether that contact has been made. I would just say publicly, I think it's something that we be intentional about, whether it's at this forum or another one. I know Crested Butte has some active, adaptive nonprofits and others that work in that area, so it may be an easy one to tap.
Great. Well, Adrian, can we put that on our notes for our Monday call? I just want to thank the staff for the help on this. I think I'm making a lot of demands on them. They have to sit in on an hour call with me, and Madeline actually is joining us too. So there's a lot of work going on.
Volunteer, though.
Well, we would proceed in your absence, Madeline, so perhaps it's good you're there. So great. Thank you very much on that. Mr. Director, I don't believe Chairman Cuthair is here, so I'm going to move you ahead so we can allow him to arrive.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody, and good to be in the Southwest. And I wanted to start off with with the current fires that are going on and what the Southwest region is doing. Within our authorities and capabilities right now is that Regional Manager Dorsey informed me that we've opened all the campsites at state parks in Mancos, Ridgeway, and Navajo for fire evacuees to go if they need to or if they can't find anywhere to go. The limitation, I think, on my authority right now is to only give them half off. We'd have to do, I believe, an emergency regulation to allow that. And we're going to continue to pursue that, and if not, I think it'd probably be something to do is if we can do an emergency regulation with the commission and a phone call, we'll work with the attorneys to find out, but I think opening those campsites free of charge is probably the right thing to do and would be absolutely necessary. So thanks to the Southwest staff for doing that. The commission received a memo from me on all facets of the implementation of those 2 bills that Madeline went over, our ANS, or Bustle Free Colorado, and the Future Generations bill. I think you all saw all of the things that we've got to do either through regulation or under the legislative declaration that the legislature wanted us to do and within certain timelines. And so that memo was really just to kind of get your juices flowing and let you guys start thinking about all of the things that we've got to do in the very short time frame that we've got. And we had actually at Commissioner Bray's house, thanks for letting us sit there. He's a great host, and we had a great time there. But we talked at length about the who, the what, and how we're going to implement all this. And my intent, just so you know, is to continue to keep the commission involved in every step of this along the way, and that we're not just going away and 6 months later we're going to come back with a product and say, here, what do you think? There's a lot of decision points in there, as you can see from some of the questions about how much, when, and who we implement all of those things in those bills. And so we've got a pretty good outline. Jeff Versteeg is kind of the point of the spear on all of this, but I can assure you that every leadership team member is either pinged once or twice on a lot of those deliverables that we have, either to you and or to the public or the legislature. So we're putting that outline and that framework together, and my plan is to really update you as soon as possible, whether that's monthly or every 6 weeks, just to keep you all engaged, so you're not hit by any of this blindside. Medea got to attend the bill signings at Lake Pueblo State Park. The Southeast did a great job pulling that together. It was a little windy, and everything stayed down, and had the governor and 2 of the sponsors show up, but I think we had 3 legislators that showed up. And I believe one of the sponsors, Senator Quorum, is going to be at our dinner tonight. Oh, he's going to come down and visit. And, you know, he's a good friend of the agency, and we love him. He's fun to be around, and we'll have a special recognition for him tonight. So it was a great turnout. First time I've received a pen from the governor, and it was because Don Quorum said, give one to Broscheid. So I've got it. I'll hand it around. You all can touch it. It was touched by the governor's hands, but anyway, that was a really neat event, and really glad to be there, and to see the public that turned out was really cool, because this, you know, it was, yes, Doug Vilsack did a lot of work, DNR, CPW, but if it wasn't for the public showing up the way they did, this bill wouldn't have moved, and we really appreciate it, and we were real glad to sign this, because this was really their bill, and so great to see that turnout. Les mentioned about the Partners Conference. We wrapped that up, and I know a lot of commissioners were there, and that was awesome to see. I'm really glad you all showed up. It was noticed, and it was noticed very heavily how engaged you all were. To the, just around 500 people attended that conference. It's growing every year. I think we're outgrowing Beaver Run Resort. That's how big we are. So that success of that event, you guys were all there. Would love your feedback, but you know, I think to tie it into Les's comments, and I did get to speak to the commissioner at length, and we are absolutely glad to have Department of Ag and anybody representing the agricultural sector, because the way this whole conference kind of got started was built on what we called the shift principles, or the outdoor principles, that we all agreed this commission passed in full support, and one of those major areas is the role that agriculture plays in wildlife conservation, in recreation, in economies, all of those things. It is woven through every one of these principles, and so Don and I did get a chance to talk, and we'd be glad to have you, Les, and as many people as you can offer up. The agriculture segment is huge in Colorado, and we'd be glad to have you. So you all, as I have been receiving a lot of emails on the recent applications and the draw process. A lot of them, it's hard to answer because I think there's a lot of people that have views of what went on and go back, and really it's been, you know, we've been responding to the ones that we can if there's questions, but we have our draw people pull in all of the data right now on what would happen with odds, what happened with application rates, and really I don't have much more than let's pull that data, let's run some analytics, and then let's come back and talk to you guys as well as the members of the public, and just kind of talk about more thorough overview, what happened, and then what we can do is then start to educate a lot of folks on what happened and what didn't, and what's fact and what's not fact. So we are absolutely on this and have been on it for a few days now. So hopefully we'll drag Corey Chick up here and he can explain that a lot better than I can. And then one of the final pieces, you know, we've got several pieces of legislation running through Congress right now that we track either directly or through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act, we're absolutely tracking the Farm Bill. It sounds like that has stalled in the House right now, and we're big supporters of getting this Farm Bill and the Farm Bill reauthorized. It's an awesome program, and it certainly affects what we do. So we're hoping that's just kind of politics, and that they'll get it out of the House here pretty soon once they get all that ironed out. But one of the things that did pass through the House was the National Defense Authorization Act. This is basically sets the budget for the military, but it also becomes the vehicle for a lot of riders. And a couple of the riders that certainly affect us as state wildlife agencies and Parks and Wildlife is the provisions that were included in that is the implementation of the Sykes Act, which is the federal legislation that drives a military, basically the military and on those lands that the military conducts operations and mission-oriented activities, was under the purview of the Fish and Wildlife Service, where the states as well as tribal entities and then the branch of service were co-signers on what they call INRAMPs, or Integrated Natural Resource Management Plans. And this drove natural resource conservation programs on those bases or those lands. They've moved that from Fish and Wildlife Service to the Department of Interior now, is going to be leading that effort. There's another provision in there that the states, the tribes, and the public will get an abbreviated public review of NRAMPs only when there's significant changes to the previous NRAMP, because these are 5 or 10 year documents, and then they go through and update them, and then states and tribes and Fish and Wildlife Service would all sit down and be co-signatories on these documents, not just a reviewer. So we have to approve these. So it sounds like they're only going to let that happen, reviews happen if there's significant changes. And then there's a 10-year prohibition on the listing of the greater sage-grouse and the lesser prairie chicken. Both of those are not listed right now, but they are heavy in Colorado, as you know. So that 10-year prohibition would basically prevent any of those listings, those for the next 10 years. And then there was an addition that would block any future judicial review of those actions. So it would be about 10 years. So we're tracking that. It did pass out of the House overwhelmingly, and we'll see what the Senate does. So hopefully the AFWA will keep us updated on what's going on with a lot of the other pieces of legislation. So, Mr. Chairman, that's kind of my abbreviated report.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Director. You mentioned in your report the parks passes, and I think I shared with you my conundrum recently in trying to buy an annual pass and the connectivity that has to a vehicle, and some opportunity to think about that. I don't know whether that's on the agenda later, or I just noted it in your report. So can you give us some sense of where that's headed?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And Jeff, I did forget to mention, Jeff's coming up later to kind of dive a little bit more into the weeds a little bit. But yeah, the park pass, certainly the legislature and the agency agrees. It's fixing it to a vehicle. We could probably do better. And so the legislature was really looking at sort of a hang pass or a transferable pass. And we actually had a really good discussion on the leadership team about what does that look like. We're also kicking around maybe a family pass where the family could purchase it, and then every member of the family can have access to use that. We're talking about a little bit what the National Park Service does, where you can have people who sign on to that pass and then they can use it. And then I think there's, the mobile app is kind of the ultimate goal down the road, is that, well, we should be looking at digital and having this on the person that you can have access to. I think that would include a lot of the bikers and those kind of things. And then we're also going to be looking at what other states have done, pretty innovative stuff where it's copycatting, but it's having the hang pass and then you slip in the validation of that pass. So we're definitely heading that way. I think with the ultimate goal is that this is a stopover for somewhere down the road, is that we're going mobile and we're going digital, and then allowing our customers to access that way. So
Just a general comment I'll make too as well. Our emails are full of observations, I think would be the polite way of saying it, about impacts from the A&S bill, the draw, the Parks Pass, various other types of things like that. So we encourage the public to keep letting us know. As we implement this, we'll obviously, I think, Director, react to the unintended consequences that seem to come up out of every human activity, including legislation. So I hope that's somewhat responsive to the public's in my email.
it is, and you know, probably one of the biggest was, why didn't you guys think of this? And we did. As you know, the commission weighed this pretty heavily. I don't think we realized what the impact of additional applications was going to be. It would have been a real wag of how many more applications would come in. We're seeing, I've talked with a lot of other states too, we're seeing an increase in applications, you know, a lot in the west, and neighbors to the north. So I don't know, is it the economy? Is it people have more money to spend, or you know, our recruitment and retention efforts? So there's a lot of things that came into seeing an increase of about 150,000 applications into our latest draw. So we're hearing the public for sure, and like you said, Chairman, keep coming in. We want to hear from you, because I think as we were talking about this change, I think a lot of folks are focused on let's pay after we're drawn. Oh, that's great, and now we're kind of seeing consequences of some of that we had discussed. I know the commission weighed real heavily in that decision, is what's this going to do to preference points and odds in the draw. So hopefully we'll have some data to come back and really inform the commission on what to do next.
Great. Thank you for that. Pat, I'm not getting, I know you're sending me texts, but I'm not getting them. So if you want to tell me on.
You mean like the old-fashioned?
Old-fashioned.
I got caught passing a note.
Okay, so can you do your recognition now?
Certainly.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Chairman Sage, I hope you don't mind me moving things around, and you can stay with us. Thank you.
Chairman Howard, Pat Dorsey, Southwest Region Manager, Commissioners, Council, staff. I know it's always a great honor for the Commission to be part when we recognize volunteers and other important people to delivering CPW's mission. So today the Southwest Region, specifically Area 15 and Mancos and Lone Mesa State Parks, along with the region, would like to make 3 awards presentations. And I'd like to start that off with Matt Thorpe, the Area 15 Wildlife Manager, who will be followed by Scott Elder, and then I'll make the last presentation.
Directors, Commissioner, I'm Matt Thorpe, Area Wildlife Manager here in Durango, and I'm joined by Leland Flores, who's our Administrative Assistant. And actually, I'm going to let him do this presentation, so I'll turn it over to Leland.
Welcome, Leland.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you, Directors. I would like to ask that Derek Snyder, and do we have Clark or Gail in as well? Can we get them, please? One of our largest volunteer projects in Area 15 is our Durango Wildlife Museum, which I know some commissioners and directors have been to before in the past. Our volunteer program with that project, we have a small group of volunteers, and we have roughly over 11,000 hours in that project since 2009. We have more before that we're not able to quite count. And our museum sees around 15 to close to 16,000 visitors a year in the Durango area, with only a handful of 1 or 2 volunteers a day managing through that. So it's a pretty large volunteer project, and I would like Clark, Gail, and Derek, our current volunteers, can you please stand and come up? You can please come on.
There's no need to be afraid. We love volunteers.
Gail is our current president of our volunteers, who helps organize everything that goes on to the day-to-day. Derek handles a lot of our scheduling, and then Clark is one of our longtime volunteers as well as Derek. And so, and they also build Bluebird boxes for sale as well, which help that money go back into the museum itself. So on behalf of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Durango and Area 15 in the Southwest region, we'd like to present you guys with this award.
One thing I just wanted to point out, the museum's actually only open from May through September. So, I mean, if you think about the volume of traffic that comes through there, basically during that summer period, it's really exceptional. So I have a great story I could tell you about Clark and his dedication, but catch me at the lunch break and I'll fill you in on that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, commissioners and directors. Welcome to the Southwest, and my name is Scott Elder. I'm the Lone Mesa and Mancos State Park Manager, along with the Customer Service Center that we operate in the town of Dolores. And I thank you for this opportunity to recognize the extraordinary customer service and commitment to our mission of one of our own. We are extremely proud at Lone Mesa and Mancos to serve approximately 82,000 visitor days each year, steward over 13,000 acres of land and water in 3 locations stretched over about 50 miles, and provide safe and unique recreation experiences for our visiting public. At Lone Mesa and Mancos, you'll find 4 of the rarest Colorado native plants known to exist, a preserved array of archaic archaeological resources that amazes even our very experienced local archaeologists in southwest Colorado. You'll find headwaters of an important watershed, providing habitat to native fish, including the round-tailed chub and flannelmouth sucker. Paleo and geologic resources described as excitingly rare by the most recent surveying geologist. Some of the finest big game habitat in southwest Colorado, hunted under a unique high-quality public hunting program, and family-focused camping and trail opportunities, and one of the area's trout and perch fisheries with the highest levels of angler success. To the extent that revenue is a measure of the complexity of a park area or program, Lone Mesa, Mancos, and the Dolores office generated $306,853 in fiscal year 17. It's on pace to increase that by about 5% in fiscal year 18. That fiscal year 17 total exceeded that reported revenue of operations like the Crawford Paonia Schweitzer Complex, Yampa Elkhead, John Martin, and Staunton, and approached that of our own Area 15 and the Front Range operation of Bar Lake. All operations staffed with multiple full-time year-round employees. We are not. In this single FTE operation, we lean very heavily, arguably too heavily at times, on temporary employees and volunteers. Temporaries who make up for lower pay and lack of benefits with their deeply felt commitment to what we do, the people and critters we do it for, and the lands and waters on which we do it. One of the most committed and special of those I know is temporary ranger Vicki Koss. Vicki has served 14 seasons with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, giving up a full-time year-round position with the National Park Service to find her fit in the way we serve customers in our state parks. Beyond her long weeks during her paid summer season supervising Mancos State Park, Vicki has logged over 1,093 volunteer hours. And her being the kind of person reluctant to log hours, I know that only scratches the surface of her service. Mancos visitors know her by name and she them. In a recent review of 105 hunter exit surveys from Lone Mesa State Park, 34 of them mentioned Vicki by name, in thanks for her interpretation of the area and of hunting and for her helpfulness. Vicki Koss is a stellar example of how this agency cares for the assets trusted to CPW by the people of the state of Colorado, and how we connect people to those special places and experiences. So it is for those reasons that I'm awarding this 2018 Distinguished Service Award to Ranger Vicki Koss. It's in my best interest to keep her trust, and I promised that I would not have her say anything. But as you get a chance during lunch, I've asked her to stick around during lunch if you get a chance to talk to her about her 14 years of service to this great agency. She has a lot of great stories as well. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
I'm going to say one short thing. My success is all due to my boss, Scott Elder.
And I'm back at the mic, and I should be smart enough by now to know you don't follow Scott Elder, or at least you don't follow him very well. So I would like to end this with one more presentation, and you can say that the Southwest region is isolated, but we stick together, and I think that's really important. And we're really fortunate down here to have a Safari Club chapter in the Four Corners Safari Club that supports just about everything we do. And they support things beyond our agency. They've sponsored youth education events. They've sent young hunters and target shooters to national competitions. They've bought elk collars and deer collars. They've helped to minimize game damage and do research in the Dove Creek area when we were getting hit by sunflower damage to a huge degree. And most recently, they put out bear collars for part of the Durango Bear Study, which, as you know, collected more data than I think any study up to this time. And so what I have for Four Corners Safari Club, and Mia, I think you're going to accept the award for okay. That's what Matt Howell told me. He said Mia will be there to accept the award. So is a photo of some of the bears that we were able to visit during the study because of the radio collars we put out. And on the back is a map of B67's big adventure. And so B67 was the 67th bear they captured, and she was a female bear. The data points are on the back, but she basically wandered all over the Four Corners, and I thought it was especially fitting for Four Corners and your chapter, and I really do thank you for everything you do. Thank you.
Okay, well, that is great. Always my favorite part of the meeting is the recognition component. I'm going to, if it's okay with Chairman Sage, I was going to invite her to lunch, and then perhaps we could have our tribal Colorado discussion after lunch. If that doesn't meet your schedule, then we could go ahead. I just wanted to give Chairman Cuthair a little extra time, if that's all right. Do you? So why don't we go ahead now then, just as we've got it scheduled. Great. Commissioners, then next on our agenda is a special item with special guests, representatives of our neighbors, the two sovereign tribes, the Ute Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes. And because these guests are independent sovereign governments, I'm uncomfortable asking them to come to the podium. We're here to greet them as government to two sovereign governments. So, Commissioners, I've asked staff to reconfigure our arrangement with a table and chairs just like ours. And while staff is doing that, I'm going to go forward to greet our guests personally. And I invite all the commissioners to join me in doing that. And then we'll take our seats, and I have a few brief things to say in greeting. And I'll invite the tribes to say or present anything that they would like to do. So. think so. Southern Utes.
Musical chairs this time, but that's okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Opening.
Chairman Sage, welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation to visit the commission. We believe since we are in this part of Colorado for a meeting with our constituents, that it was important as a sign of respect to invite both tribes to join us. And we're so very pleased that you could. Come and join us, and we look forward, obviously, many of the commissioners, we're going to do a tour of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Park. We appreciate that invitation. I know Chairman Cuthair is not here, but I'd like to at least put it on the record. It's important also that we acknowledge the tribes as the first conservationists on the landscape. It's easy to see evidence of that, not only on tribal lands, but throughout this part of Colorado. We acknowledge not only tribal conservation efforts on tribal lands, but their important cultural role in consulting on ancestral burial grounds beyond tribal lands, as well as treaty rights. We also want to acknowledge and thank the tribes for working with us, government to government, when that makes sense and when the tribes believe that makes sense. We hope that we can expand this voluntary cooperation in the future. And again, thank you for honoring us with your visit.
Well, thank you. I feel humbled and honored. I feel like I should be over there. No. At this time, I'd like to recognize this is our Director for Wildlife Resource Manager, Mr. Steve Whiteman. His department has a very good relationship with the Colorado State Wildlife Management and law enforcement. We, as Southern Ute and Colorado, have a common interest in managing and protecting our shared wildlife resources. This includes not only the migratory big game species like deer and elk that we hunt every fall, but also the many other species of mammals, birds, and fish that freely move across our political boundaries every day. Our governments have an important responsibility to ensure that these sacred animal resources and their habitat persist long into the future, for both their inherent value and also for their value to our citizens. In 2009, the tribe entered into an agreement with the state of Colorado concerning Southern Utes' exercise of long-held hunting rights that date back to the 1874 Bruno Treaty between the Ute Indians and the United States government. This treaty ensured that our members would be able to continue to hunt, fish, and gather throughout the entire San Juan Mountain region for our sustenance and to support our traditional cultural connection to the land. The 2009 agreement with the state represents an important recognition of these tribal rights and our commitment to work together so these rights may be fully realized. I am proud to say that staff agreement because that staff for the tribe and state have worked very well together to uphold the cooperative spirit and intent of this agreement. Because these rights are very important to all of our members. Many times in other areas of the country, tribes and states do not share this type of strong working relationship on treaty commitments and matters of wildlife management and enforcement. In addition to our treaty hunting rights throughout the San Juan Mountains region, I would like to point out another example of where our governments are working well together in the best interest of our citizens and our wildlife resources. As you probably know, Highway 160 is a major transportation corridor stretching east to west in and out of our reservation and perfectly bisecting the seasonal migration routes of the San Juan Basin deer and elk herds. This area of Highway 160, especially near Chimney Rock National Monument, is ranked as one of the worst in the entire state of wildlife vehicle collisions, costing immense amounts of money in vehicle damages, injuries to motorists, and loss of hundreds, if not thousands, of animals every year. The tribe, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and Colorado Department of Transportation are presently working together on the funding, planning, and design for multiple wildlife crossing structures on Highway 160 on tribal land in the Chimney Rock area. The funding commitments and design plans are coming together nicely. This will be a major multi-million-dollar project over the next several years involving substantial investments by the partners. The end product will be a major improvement in safety for motorists passing through our region and the protection of untold numbers of animals that would otherwise be lost to the highway. This is an excellent example of governments working together to address a significant shared challenge to our wildlife. As we move forward in this time, with more and more people moving into the region and ever-increasing pressures on the land, both man-made and natural, it becomes even more important to remember the needs of our wildlife resources and to manage and protect them as best we can. Because these resources are largely shared across our various political boundaries, the Southern Ute Indian Tribe is committed to working with our neighbors in the interest of the wildlife and our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And I would also like to thank Mr. Wyman for attending our Partners Conference, where he participated in a panel that I got to watch, which was very informative and gave us a lot of detail on the conservation efforts on the tribal lands. So we appreciate that very much. Thank you. Commissioners, any comments or things you'd like to say to Chairman Say? Commissioner Zimmerman.
Thank you again so much. I'm also thrilled about the work along 160, and I know we're going to be hearing more about that in coming meetings as work progresses, so thanks for mentioning that. I think that's, wildlife crossings are something we've been talking about a lot lately on the commission over the last couple of years, something we've been looking at how to allocate funding, how to look at ways we can do conservation along the roadways to help animals get to areas where they can cross. So continued effort on that across our political boundaries and our various different land ownership boundaries, from private to public to Forest Service or BLM, I think is going to be really helpful. So I'm thrilled that you guys are involved as well.
Commissioner Bray.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. I've always greatly appreciated and admired your tribe's wildlife management, and I always thought it was extremely good and very, very appropriate. I have a question for you, though, on, as you probably know, us in the Southwest here, we're experiencing pretty serious cow-calf ratio decline and calf recruitment. I have a two-pronged question for you. I know you guys are actively managing your tribal lands a little differently than we do in Colorado and are allowed to do under some statutes from time to time. And your management's highly respected. My two-pronged question would be, number one, on your tribal properties that you manage, are you experiencing the same thing with cow-calf recruitment issues? And have you identified some reasons or some possible solutions?
I'll let Steve answer.
Thank you, Commissioner Bray. We work very closely with the Durango Parks and Wildlife Office and coordinate on a wide variety of fish and wildlife surveys every year. Our annual aerial game counts are a good example of that cooperation. And we do indeed fly all over the tribal lands every January and work closely with biologists, not only at Parks and Wildlife, but also our Hickory Apache neighbors to the south and State of New Mexico Game and Fish. And we are indeed observing a steadily declining calf-cow ratio in the San Juan Basin, and it is a mysterious, it's a mystery to the different management agencies that are studying this problem in this area. We don't have an answer yet, but we do hope to shed some light on that at some point soon. I do understand Parks and Wildlife is doing some predator studies that may reveal whether or not predators are having some influence on calf recruitment, but we just don't have the answers yet.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. Commissioners, any other comments or questions or thoughts? Chairman Sage, thank you so much for coming. We're really grateful and honored that you did come, and we hope that we will have a chance to see you again at future commission meetings in this area. And obviously, if there's anything I can do or any commissioner, I hope that you'll let us know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess we'll adjourn for lunch, if that's okay.
Hey, Bob, can I steal your charger?
Who, what?
Your charger?
So quiet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wildlife Commission meeting here in Cortez. Just before we get started, Commissioners, the staff has, at my suggestion, provided us with a very inexpensive way of recognizing folks around the state. I'm going to pass this around. It's a classic challenge coin. Those of you that know military officers or other government agencies will know that these are often handed out as a small token of appreciation. So I'm going to pass them down this way. Unless if you could get it back to me, I'll pass them down this way. And then just to give a little tension to keep the meeting exciting, I'm going to award this first coin, our first challenge coin, to somebody in the room at some point later on this afternoon. So here you go, Michelle.
So be on your best behavior.
That's right. Don't blow it now.
Give us some guidelines?
I know. Yeah, where do we
We
be
want
judged?
guidelines, don't we? Want to know.
I will say that you're in the, you're in the bubble of possibilities in that.
Guideline, Chairman,
Commissioner Vigil.
a guideline, nobody from DNR will get it.
discrimination.
I think Mr. Vilsack probably deserves one, but we'll wait on that. Justin, I think you're up.
Good afternoon, Commission. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Justin Rudder. I am the Assistant Director for Financial Services for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I continue to call my presentation the financial update, but there are three parts to this financial update. The first one is the dashboard, which is what I will probably consider the update going forward. And then there's two memos that you received in your mailing separately, one on the effects of Senate Bill 200, the para-compromise, whatever it was, the para bill, and then another one on the Pittman-Robertson tax receipts. I will be covering those through the slides as well, just for discussion purposes. So you do have the dashboard as a separate PDF instead of as a slide if you want to pull it up separately. This is very similar to the dashboard I presented last month. A couple small changes in the lower right. Instead of having bar graphs for GOCO funds, those are now area graphs separated for Parks and Wildlife. The total grants awarded is the total height of the graph, and then the expended is the bottom portion. You will notice some variations in awarded and expended as grants expire, as they are finished. Both the awarded amount and the expended amount come off the graph, so that's why you see some dips overall. Going to the bottom left, that is our personal services and operating budgets. In the title is the amount of the year that we have gone through. So going through period 10 of 12, the percentage is there in the title, and then you can see down below what percentage we are expended on both personal services and operating. We are tracking below on operating, which we discussed some last time, and we are tracking slightly above on personal services. The budget for personal services was projected in December of 2017, and so we are tracking slightly ahead of what we thought we'd be there, but not worryingly so. Above that is the kind of payments to others. It's updated for the month. Above that is so now we're to the second box kind of down on the left, is the kind of metrics, the hunters, the fishers. Those have not been updated. We are still working with Aspira to kind of get the reports that we need. We've met with their staff and have kind of outlined the report. They're working on it, and we expect to start updating those numbers more regularly. And then lastly, up at the top, we have revenues and expenditures. You may notice that we appear to be upside down. Our expenditures exceed our revenues, which could be worrisome, but fortunately, I'm not overly worried. Excuse me. So based on looking at the numbers, revenue is down $9.2 million year over year, which is more significant when you look at wildlife cash and parks cash separately, $10 million and $5 million down independently. And lottery utilization is up, so that's why we see a lower number down overall. Expenses are also up year over year, but parks cash expenses and wildlife cash parks cash expenses are down while wildlife cash expenses are up, so it's kind of a mixed picture there. So for revenue, I think the important thing to understand is that we have not booked all of the revenue that we've received so far through IPAWS. With Go Live, there's always challenges, and one of those was getting reconciled numbers so that we had sales data that backed up our cash receipt data. We've been working on that extensively in accounting and financial services. We are, for parks, we were, when this data was pulled, we were reconciled through March, and wildlife was 5 weeks behind at this data. So I suspect that those year-over-year revenues are more or less flat once we get everything booked, but we are still going through the commissions, through the credit card fees, and through the sales data to reconcile back to our actual cash receipts and ensure we're booking it properly. By fiscal year end, we are on track to have everything booked and recorded. For expenses, construction contract services was up $6 million, which I think for those that are worried about throughput, such as our friends at GOCO, that's a good sign. We are spending more on construction. The steps we've taken to speed up not only the coding for construction, but the construction process itself, as was identified in the audit, I think that's a good sign for those changes are working. OIT is up $2.1 million, which I don't think would surprise anybody that deals with OIT, and that's just from our appropriation year over year. So that 1.3 permanent personal services, that's where we're tracking slightly ahead of budget. And then land purchases are down and grants are down. Land purchase is down 5.3 million year over year. I think that is reflective of the RFP pause and some of the challenges we've been having at CDC. And so that's kind of it on the dashboard, unless anybody has questions.
Mr. Chairman? Well, you are chairman of the Finance Committee.
It's an honor to be there. I'd like comments from the entire commission, because we asked Justin or something like this, that we can look at every meeting, and we have kind of the same charts and graphs, so we become really familiar. But I just like everybody's comment. Is this really what you want to see? Because it's a small group of us on the finance committee. There's just 3 of us plus Justin, and sometimes Chairman Howard is there also, but he doesn't get a vote. So any comments? Is this clear? Is this what everybody would like to see?
Commissioner Haskett.
Thank you. I like this better than what we were looking at before. I think it's easier to understand, and if we're consistent each time, it's a whole lot easier to look at. So I think you guys are doing great. Thank you.
I love graphs. I love visuals. It's so easy. I can look at that from clear back here and go, yeah. And I do see that that our, let's see.
For the record, that's Commissioner Paizo.
Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. 2017, our revenue is higher and our expenses were, this year our revenue is lower and our expenses are higher, but it's easy to see that.
Whether you want to or not.
Whether you want to or not. So then I can say, why is that?
Justin, how will trends show up? You know, when you've got 6 months of data and how will that show up on the dashboard?
And that's something I'm working on, thank you. I think sort of where we're going with the GOCO grants in the lower right is where I'd like to go, but I'm gonna have to simplify some of the data above, and so I'm gonna try to maybe do subcharts below with some of that detail, just so that we kind of have a slight more detail than just total expenses, total revenue, without getting too visually busy. But I do want to, I've done this twice now, so I have 2 months that I could kind of trend, but I can go back and grab more data as we go. But ideally, this would grow to a reasonable level year or so of data, or 5 years for annual data. Because the GOCO grants in the lower right are just back, well, it's this fiscal year, year to date, which I think makes sense, but.
Commissioners, any other comments or questions? Thanks, Justin.
All right, so on to, there was a memo in your packet on the reported drop in Pittman-Robertson excise tax revenue. So there's a few articles floating around that were talking about a 30% year-over-year drop in PR receipts, and that is in fact true. If we had spent some time with the data, and if my projections for the end of the year are correct, this will be the worst year out of the last 6, but it'll also be the 6th best year ever. So besides the last 5 years, prior to this one, this year will be better than any other year in PR history. So we're still, it's not in the pits, still a great deal of money that's coming to the agency annually. I spent a lot of time working on trend analysis and trying to find inflection factors that would cause kind of the reversal in fortunes for PR receipts, and I'm not smart enough to find it. Almost any trend you try to put to this will pop straight through the end of that downturn at the end, because overall the trend is upward, and I do think that there's a base demand and a base desire for those goods that are taxed under PR. So if I were to guess, I think we're probably going to be steady around here, but I have no idea. If this was a stock graph, I could say that there's a nice resistance line at 150, where you can see it approached it earlier on and then busted through it later, and now we've seen a double top. But that also makes no sense for analyzing quarterly sales data. So if we continue the quarter-by-quarter trend, we see about $15 million in PR receipts, which is down from almost $20 million from the current year, from the current grant round. But the thing is that CPW has never tried to expend every dollar PR it receives. We were expecting, for years, we were talking about the Obama bump, where gun sale or gun legislation, talk about gun control, we would expect to see an increase in gun sales. And we did not think the $20 million level was necessarily sustainable, so we've never been trying to get there. Currently, we have a carry forward amount, which is amounts that we have not obligated, that we are allowed to, of nearly $15 million. So with where we're at for projected expenditures and where we're at for revenue at $15 million, we could do 5 years of our current programs without taking reductions. So PR receipts are down, revenues are down, but not in a damaging way for CPW.
Questions, commissioners? Commissioner Veal.
And that's a good point of we're not spending everything you have. So we're keeping some of that money and it'll help us carry through some of the down years.
Absolutely. If we had tried to keep up with PR and we were spending $20 million a year right now, having a $5 million drop would be painful to absorb in 1 year, especially. So now we have a runway. If we need if gun sales continue to trend down, we have time to see that and adjust accordingly.
That's why it's wise to be financially conservative.
I knew I liked you.
Thank you, Justin.
And then the final issue is the memo on Senate Bill 18200, which is the para stabilization bill. This addresses the unfunded liability within the para pension system. A number of changes were proposed, a number of changes were made. It was an extended negotiation in the legislature and was one of the last major pieces of business they did. So for increased contributions, the employer, I'll start with the order of the slide. So the employee contributions will go up by a total of 2% over the next 3 years. 0.75% for the first 2 and 0.5% later. So that will be deductive from employees' take-home pay. I included the percentages and the dollar figures there because traditionally the state has not allowed employees' pay to be cut, take-home pay to be cut. They've offset it with increases even if they're small. So I think through the standard salary survey process, if I were to guess, I'd expect to see greater than 0.75% for kind of cost of living increases over those 3 years. So in a way, it comes out of the employee's pocket, and in a way, it might come out of the employer's pocket, but we pay the whole salary either way. So it'll be additive to our payroll base. For employer contributions, the employer is only going up by 0.25%, which on our payroll is only $171,000, so not very impactful. The big numbers come in with the direct distribution. So the state as a whole has acknowledged that a stable pension system is required for the function of state government, and the general fund for this upcoming year will be paying $225 million directly to para to offset the direct distribution, or to offset the unfunded liability. That $225 million is about 3% of total salaries in the para system, and it's calculated to pay off the unfunded liability in 30 years. There's mechanisms in the bill to adjust all of these numbers to try to meet that goal of paying off the unfunded liability within 30 years, including if we get to 120% funded, then they can start ratcheting down contributions. But a 120% funded pension system seems like a big target for future legislatures. And then it gets a little complicated. The bill states that in future years, the governor's office may request sources other than general fund to pay this $225 million direct distribution. The important thing to understand is that it is going not to just pay off the state division of para. There's, I think, 6 divisions of para. The 225 is to pay off every unfunded liability except for the local government section. So that's DPS, that's troopers, that's school division, that's state division, that's judicial. I've had the conversations that occurred around the bill, and so they.
Justin, can I just ask you a question on the methodology? I'm very conscious of not wanting to go down a rat hole with para, but did you just say that this is to make it 100% funded?
Yes, sir. And if they fall below 98% funded, then they ratchet up the contributions. If the projections fall below 98% funded.
So normally in a private company, it'd be 60 to 70% would be a normal funding, and then you're counting on growth and investment growth too, so.
So it's actuarially funded, so they are counting on returns over time.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
So the 225 is intended to pay off. The conversations that have surrounded this kind of lead me to believe that the governor's office may be thinking of this payment as kind of a general cost of government. This is just what it is, what it costs to be a part of state government. And I've received some informal inquiries about how we could use grants or cash to pay for our portion of the 225 million. And our portion is where it gets a little bit tricky. If we are looking at 3% of salary, our portion is about $1.8 million to pay off our fair share of the unfunded liability. But the state being the governor's office, has said that that $225 million liability is the state's responsibility, which could be interpreted to mean the 18 principal departments of which they control the budget request. And if they want us to take on our 1/18th-ish, our size of state government share of the $225 million, then it would be $8 million a year to pay off the unfunded liability. And $6 million of that would not be directly related to our staff or our staff's retirement. So we will be having continued conversations about this over the summer. I just wanted to put it on your radar that I'm fairly confident that we have a $1.8 million liability coming up, and it could be up to $8 million, which, having just passed future generations, seeing so much money going out the door so quickly is painful to see.
Questions, commissioners? Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Next up, Mr. Versteeg. Jeff, welcome to the podium. We don't often get to see you there.
Thank you, and that's by design, because we put our best and brightest up here, and that's why I'm usually on the bench. But I'm sort of the blunt instrument today, our razor sharp instrument. Danielle is back in our headquarters. It didn't seem reasonable to ask her to travel 3 days for a 5 or 10 minute agenda item. And since it's one of the more simple regulations that's been before you in years, I thought I could do my best to cover for her. So, agenda item 12 is chapter W0. That's on your iPads. The part that you're going to be asked to act upon begins on page 7. And just a little bit of background, what we're simply asking you to do here is to make sure the fees that our customers are currently paying today for hunting and fishing and annual and daily park passes, for example, do not change, which, if you fail to act, will change on August 8th. And those fees will go up to the amount that the Senate Bill 18-143 provided. So we told you last month that we didn't feel it was good business or good customer service to raise the price of our products for our customers in the middle of a fishing year, a camping season, and so forth. And so if you adopt this regulation today, the prices that people are paying today will be the same prices they pay on August 8th and August 9th and through the remainder of calendar year 2018. That allows staff and the commission the remaining months of this calendar year to develop a plan to address the increased fee authority you were granted through that bill. And as the director's memo laid out, we will be bringing to you in late summer, early fall, some recommendations on how and when to raise those fees that you are now allowed to do. So simply here, we're just asking you to freeze these license fees in place until you choose to change them and not allow the statute to go into effect immediately on August 8th and change all of those.
Commissioners, questions for Mr. Versteeg? Mr. Vio.
Just a comment. I think it makes sense to do that. It's just not right to have some people paying one fee and somebody else paying another fee. So I think it makes sense to freeze it.
Thank you. And I should have said my apologies to the audience and to the commission. For the record, I'm Jeff Versteeg, Assistant Director for Research, Policy, and Planning. I'm the Bench B team for Danielle Eisenhardt.
Any other questions or comments? It's an action item, if I understand things, so we can entertain a motion. Oh. You have public comment?
The lawyer's nodding.
I don't have a motion on the floor yet. I'll do the public comment once we have a motion.
Make a motion, we freeze the rates,
Second.
or freeze the fees as staff requests.
Second.
Second from Commissioner Hauser. Any further discussion from commissioners? Do we have any public comment slips? Anybody in the public like to come forward and comment? Very good. Adrian, let's go ahead and call the roll on this one.
Okay. Bray?
Yes.
Haskett?
Yes.
Hauser?
Yes.
Peisel?
Yes.
Vigel?
Yes.
Wingfield?
Yes.
Zimmerman is absent. And Chairman Howard.
Yes.
Motion carried unanimously.
Thank you.
Jeff. Great. Next up, we have the science behind big game management. Reed, I believe you want to do an introduction and start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Commissioners, Director Broscheid, Assistant Director West. I'm Reed DeWalt, Assistant Director of Wildlife and Natural Resources. I know I don't appear on the agenda right now, but I thought I'd take this opportunity to kind of kick off this agenda topic, as you'll be seeing this 3 times over the next 3 meetings. And really what has spurred this agenda topic and the importance behind it is the importance of license setting, as we experienced it at the last meeting, herd management plans, which you'll see later today, and just our overall process on how we determine how many licenses and how many opportunities to offer each year. So we thought it would be a good time to just have a conversation with all of you about the science behind how we get to that. So this is purely informational, but I hope it's a discussion and that you feel that you can ask questions at any time during this. And so today we're going to be looking at data collection and how we collect data on our terrestrial big game species. And then at the next meeting, we're going to be looking more at how we model that data and come up with our population goals, as well as our herd management planning. Andy Holland gave you a little bit of an overview of that previously, but we'll discuss that in further detail. And then our last presentation in this series will be the actual license setting process and all the science and work that goes into that. So just to give you guys a better understanding and maybe some more confidence in what our scientists are doing and what happens before the May meeting when you see those license recommendations. So today we've asked Brad Banulis to come and present to you. And Brad is an area terrestrial biologist in Area 18, which is the Montrose office. And I know he's familiar with Commissioner Bray and sends his greetings to you, I'm sure. So with nothing else, I'll introduce Brad and turn the floor over to him. So thank you.
Thank you, Reed.
I think we're good to go here. Thank you, Commissioners. Chairman Howard, Director Broscheid, Assistant Director Madeline West. Appreciate it. I don't often get to, or actually haven't really gotten the opportunity to come to talk to the Commissioners. So I really do appreciate this, and especially on something like this where it's actually not a decision driven, but maybe more we can have just a discussion and conversation about what we do as terrestrial biologists. So like Reed said, this is the first of 3 presentations that we'll talk about on the science behind big game management. Perfect. So let's see. So with this, what we're really kind of talking about is just really kind of getting at the basics of wildlife management as well. So what is wildlife management? The application of ecological knowledge to populations of wildlife and their plant and animal associate in a manner that strikes a balance between the needs of those populations and the needs of people. So really, it's kind of managing wildlife populations in relation to the habitat that they need and the habitat that we share. So dealing with conflicts possibly, as well as just trying to meet requirements for minimizing conflict, as well as providing watchable wildlife opportunity and maybe a recreational hunting opportunity. And to get at that for Big Game Management Colorado, we kind of got to get into this whole discussion on population dynamics. So what is population dynamics? Well, it's the science and study that we're studying the size and age composition of populations as dynamic systems and the biological and environmental processes that drive them. So we need to understand what the population is, what they're doing, and what those influences are affecting them. So you guys have seen this, this slide here on the annual cycle of management, actually more depicted as our management by objective process when we present our herd management plans. A herd management plan will establish objectives for a given population for approximately 10 years, and then we collect the data, which we'll talk about more today, assess populations, compare to objectives, and implement hunting seasons to review on an annual basis. So what I really wanted to start out with today is this population. We don't know what this population is here. But we need to determine in order to determine how to manage this given population, we need to know where they're at. So what is our initial population? In fisheries and wildlife management, this equation here at the bottom of the slides represents the population at current time, NT. So NT plus 1 on the other side of the equals, it's kind of to manage into the future, but what we're really talking about today is trying to get more at what the population is currently, as well as these other factors of birth, death, immigration, emigration. So to know where the population is going, we need to know what the birth rate is. And in order to know what the potential is for population growth of any given population that we currently manage, or a population like this where we just don't even know how many are in there. So as in the previous slide, we kind of had some animals up here without antlers and some with antlers, representing females and males. Well, now with the birth rate, we're adding in these little juveniles into the population. So that give us an idea on population growth. After we understand what the birth rate is, the next part of the equation is really to understand what the death rate is and what those factors are affecting mortality. So we start removing animals out of a population, whether it be adults or it be juveniles. These animals with the X's across them. So now that we know what the birth rate and the death rate are, we need to understand what animals may be immigrating into the population as well from another population. Generally, animals that are moving into and out of populations are usually younger individuals. But we also need to understand these animals that are immigrating out of the population, because all these factors are going to affect what the population is currently in a given area, as well as what it's going to be in the future. So really, in general, it's to try to get at if the concept of if birth exceeds death, then the population grows, but if death exceeds birth, the population declines. So really getting at that, we're kind of trying to get at if the actual population is above the desired population objective, we can allow for more harvest. Or if the actual population is below that desired objective, then we maybe need to look at reducing some harvest. So our challenge as terrestrial biologists, district wildlife managers, senior biologists, regional managers, is to try to manage populations across the state to meet demands for watchable wildlife, for recreational hunting opportunity, as well as watchable wildlife. So this is kind of the first part of our discussion on population dynamics. So I'd throw out, is there any questions just on the general population dynamic concept?
Don't think so.
All right, well, I'll keep going. So in order to get at where we are, we really need to define the population. This map depicts our DAUs across the state that we have delineated for mule deer populations. So all of these different colors, all these different boundaries are different DAUs for specific mule deer populations. So currently, right now, we're sitting down in the southwest corner of the state, and I believe it's D29. Just to the north of us is one that I co-manage with our Durango biologist, Brad Weinmeister, in Commissioner Bray's backyard is D24. It includes Unit 70 and 71, 711. So it's critical that we define what a distinct population is based on herd movements within an area to represent all seasonal and life history requirements for a given population. Ideally, this boundary will represent a population with little immigration into and immigration out of the population, because we're hopefully just trying to manage a population that's big enough to represent those. However, we do have our state line units, especially where it provides a challenge for monitoring a population because animals are moving in and out of the state, as well as, especially on these habitat or on these DAUs where there's contiguous habitat across state lines, whether we're talking about our borders here with New Mexico, on the west side of the state with Utah, or even to the north with Wyoming. But we really kind of need to consider these options because we're managing them one way, and then other states may be managing them a different way. But again, so like I said, these maps kind of represent our DAUs. What we want to try to do is, based on those few deer that we showed on the piece of paper here previously, is define what our area is going to be for this population so that we can survey it. So to get at this, I'm going to keep kind of referencing back to that initial population dynamics equation that's down here on the bottom of the slides. And the first one that we're going to the first parameter we're trying to get to is this NT, this current year population. So quadrats are survey sampling blocks that are randomly selected across a survey area where animals will be counted, and the counts from those blocks can be extrapolated to estimate density and abundance across the entire study area. Quadrats can vary in size for different survey areas and can be selected based on previous ideas of density, maybe from some previous work that we've done. They may represent different habitat types, and that's how quadrats get allocated. Or it may also represent different behaviors. If we're actually doing quadrats for elk, we may have quadrats that are 4 kilometers in size. If we're doing density quadrats for deer, they may actually be a half a kilometer, square kilometer. So all these considerations are things that we would look at if we're doing quadrat estimates to get that first estimate. This map just depicts sampling quadrats across a landscape where these green blocks that are on the screen will be thoroughly surveyed to count all animals within that given block. So I mean, the key is really when we go in, we'd fly, we would actually start flying the boundary of that given block, and then we would do transects back and forth within the block to count every animal that could be there. Because then we're going to use those estimates from each of those blocks to get that density estimate for across the entire survey area. The issue is it's pretty intensive. It's a big effort. We can't really fly every single square kilometer or square mile across a landscape just because we don't have the funding or capacity really to fly that much time, especially across numerous populations all across Colorado. It'd be an extremely extremely intensive effort. But when we do these, and we've done these for deer and we've done these for elk, we need to really make sure, one, conditions are just perfect, we have just the right snow conditions, and then also that, that we're really, it is kind of in those key situations where we really need a point estimate as best as we can, which we could actually throw into a model to help align our population models. Yeah, Commissioner Bray.
Brad, this makes perfect sense. My question would be, do you rotate the quadrants around to different areas, different years or different periods of time?
That's a good question. Actually, we've kind of done it both ways. Where we had in the past, and you see out in Unit 70, there's some of those old orange placards that represent the corners of those. Those were fixed, and where we did that. And most of the surveys that we were done, because they were spread across different times, they were done with just those same blocks every time. Now we also have some other places where it'll be more conditions based. Maybe if it is a severe winter, then we just do a certain number of quadrats that are on severe winter range, as opposed to maybe we have good snow cover, but animals are actually distributed across the winter range. So then we may actually do more quadrats spread across that area. So it can vary.
Common sense to me would seem like you'd want to move them around at least, maybe not every year, but occasionally.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Actually, because kind of getting into something a little different, but actually even with deer on the Uncompahgre, we do our age and sex classification using quadrats. And we've really kind of stuck with the same quadrats, just more from a trend aspect, so we can look at long-term trends across those. But we are also seeing where in some of these areas, deer populations do shift over time, and habitat conditions change. So, yeah, it's something that we definitely want to address, to try to look at as well.
Thank you.
Oh, whoops. So another estimate, another way to get at a point estimate of population is distance sampling. This is something that we don't do a lot here on the western slope because we have a lot of cover, but we do on the eastern plains. We do a lot of distance sampling and transect sampling estimates for pronghorn populations. One of the key things with that is that you need to be able to, you only want to have one factor that's going to affect your siteability, and that just being distance. You don't want to have cover in there as well that's going to limit it. But when conducting transect sampling, observers for pronghorn at least will fly in a fixed-wing aircraft across this line, like flying with the aircraft from the bottom up that line, and you're going to be looking for classifying those animals as you're going on that line, looking at and keeping track actually on what the age and sex classification is, as well as what the distance from that line is. So a key concept of distance sampling is that detection of animal decreases as distance from the line increases. There's also individual variation between observers, so you have to keep track of that. But then through some statistical modeling estimates, you create a detection function model that you can use to estimate that probability of detecting a given animal at a given distance across those transects. So this map here depicts a line transect sampling design that they did for pronghorn herd 7 out in southeast Colorado, east of Pueblo area, illustrating all of the transect lines in blue. So that's every single line up there was an individual flight line that they did. They have to fly, I don't exactly remember what the elevation is, but they have to keep a certain altitude for the whole flight, because that's going to affect what your observation factor will be as well. But all these red dots indicate pronghorn groups that they observed and classified. So after running the distance sampling model, they got a population estimate, point estimate for pronghorn herd 7, DAU 7, that was derived to be at 6,987 animals. So again, this is something that provides us some good population estimates for pronghorn populations, and we can use it either as a point estimate or maybe in some other, if we actually have some different models going, like spreadsheet models, we can use it as a point to align a spreadsheet model. Another way to get at that point estimate of where we're at right now is using a mark resite. This technique requires that a portion of the population be marked, so such as these bighorns are in the picture. Typically it's a matter of going out doing some helicopter capture or some ground capture to put out collars across the landscape. And then at a later time coming in and doing a survey of the study area, whether it's being flown in a helicopter or conducted on the ground, and classifying all the individual animals that you saw and keeping track of animals that are marked as well as animals that aren't marked to get an idea of what the proportion of observed marks are, and that you can then extrapolate what a population estimate is for that given area. Again, it's a good opportunity to kind of give you maybe a place where we've got a long-term model going to give you something to align your population estimate on. We have done mark resite estimates for bighorn sheep in particular in different areas of the state. The one I'm kind of most familiar with, at least in southwest Colorado, or western Colorado, we did with desert bighorn sheep and the Black Ridge herd out of Grand Junction. But really, the primary method for estimating big game populations in Colorado is developing population models. We can use this to get at that NT, the current year estimate, as well as kind of projecting future estimates. But to develop that population estimate for a current year, again, we need to have those estimates that we were talking about in that population dynamics equation to have our different parameters for the given year, births and deaths. So this is just an example of a population model. Not going to delve too much into all the intricacies of modeling, as we'll actually do that in a future presentation. But Commissioner Bray will probably be interested in this one, at least for the estimates, as this is our D24 mule deer herd in Unit 70, 71, 711. But this is a mathematical spreadsheet model, just kind of expanding on that whole population dynamics equation that we've been talking about. The red data in the spreadsheet represents values that we collect and input into the model. So this is just like the plan was for discussion today, is what data do we collect and how does that play into population estimates? The green values are data that are collected from 5 long-term monitoring studies that we have around the state. The values actually going into this model are coming from survival data that we've collected on the Uncompahgre Plateau, which I'll go into a little more detail in a few more slides on the long-term monitoring studies. But then the blue values and the population estimates are modeled values and estimates that we use to get at a population estimate and create this population model. So like I said, we'll have a little more discussion on this even towards the end. But what we need to figure out is how do we get how do we fill all these parameters in red? So to run the population models, we need to collect the data to reflect those birthing rates, the recruitment into the population. So we can look at capturing fawns and calves, but that's really intensive effort. We actually currently have this effort even going right now on the Uncompahgre Plateau with elk survival study that we have going. And we've had 10 technicians out there. We're up to 41 calves. It's very time-intensive effort and very costly effort. But then also, we need to know how many individuals survived to be that year. So that's where the collar information can be helpful. But a better way for us to get at that really is kind of doing some classification surveys that we do, and we'll get into that here in just a sec. So part of what I want to talk about here is, and kind of show a video actually, is of classification. So what all do we do? Well, we talk about classification all the time. We talk about our observed fawn-doe ratios and buck-doe ratios, but what do we do to get there? So this video that's showing, for if everybody can see it, well, I guess maybe the commissioners can't see it on their iPads. But this illustrates, actually, can you just pause it just for a second, Adrian? So to kind of set this up, when we do our winter classification flights, well, like just to back up a little bit, we do our classification flights in the winter for mule deer and pronghorn. The reason being their animals are concentrated on winter range. And at the same time, we've already conducted hunting seasons, so we're looking at post-harvest estimates and maybe how harvest is affecting the population. And then the animals are concentrated. They're also more observable, especially in a landscape like this where we have more open sagebrush and snow cover. They're a lot more easier to observe. And then we can also, but one of the cutoffs we have is like for mule deer classification, we have to stop at January 15th because otherwise bucks will start losing antlers. Well, when we're doing our classification, we're classifying all the animals by age and sex. So we're classifying them by fawns or calves, by does or cows. For males, we break them up into 3 categories. We're looking at yearlings, 2-year-old, and then mature or 2+ old males. And all of those estimates calculate into our calf-cow ratios, fawn-doe ratios, and buck and buck-doe ratios, bull-cow ratios. So as we're seeing on this slide, on the video here, we're coming up to a group, and when we're flying, so we typically will have the biologist observing. We'll also have usually a district wildlife manager with us as well, who knows that district and where animals can be located, and then can help spot animals and help us classify as well. So, as a biologist, I've got my digital voice recorder that I'm going to say everything that's seen in there. We'll come up on this elk group. First thing I'll say, elk group. If we're coming up on a deer group, deer group. And it's just to kind of keep track of all the data that we're going to be collecting. And then at the same time, I'm holding a GPS to take that waypoint so we can actually keep track of where we are across the landscape and actually tie that back. So go ahead, Adrian. We can start showing this. So as we're coming into this group, we'll get up close so we can kind of see the animals. And we've got, right away, cow, young. And then we'll just keep going down the line. For elk especially, we'll try to get them lined out and classifying every animal. Cow, cow, young, bull, yearling bull, raghorn bull, mature bull, cow, young. I mean, and it's constant. And we'll do that I've got about 46 hours of classification that I do across my area for my units. So I think Darby does about 100 hours up in Meeker and with a lot of animals. So we're keeping track of all this information. All that information now is on our digital voice recorder. Last year, I think actually maybe this was from 2 years ago, across the state, we spent 928 hours classifying animals. So that also means that there's a little under 928 hours all on digital voice recorders that the biologist now gets to spend part of his winter listening to himself talk and classifying out animals. And then we get to go down, we get to record all that information on just on pieces of paper. Well, then we have to take all that, we have to put that into spreadsheets, format it properly, get it imported to a database so that we can generate our flight memos. And those are the flight memos that give us some of those red columns on the population model, providing us our fawn-doe ratios and our buck-doe ratios, our illustrating sex ratios and recruitment. And I think, so like I said, about 928 hours last year is what was our total flight time. Total classification, actually for this last year, 2017, 2018, which classification was down a little bit. Everybody knows it was really mild conditions across Colorado, so especially, I mean, animals were just spread from winter range up to summer range. But we still, across the state, we classified 66,154 elk, 61,134 mule deer, and 21,378 pronghorn. The one thing I didn't mention on the pronghorn is actually pronghorn classification and the distance sampling we do. We actually conduct that in the summer prior to September, because those fawns actually grow pretty fast. And so we want to make sure that we can identify fawn-doe ratios. So it's actually a pre-hunt estimate that we're calculating there. Anybody have any questions on classification?
What is all this information telling you about the elk in our corner of the state?
I would like to take public comment in an organized way, but we'll be glad to take that comment.
Sure. Yep.
Because I have other people that have signed up to give public comment on the
same.
presentation.
Sure. So we can go ahead and switch back to the presentation here. Thank you. So after we have our fawn-doe ratios, our calf-cow ratios, we know what recruitment is into the population. We also have to consider that estimate gave us the animals that survived from